Hi, I'm Chris McCreary and I'm the founder and director of the Northern Ireland Science Festival, and you're very welcome to this year's digital edition of the programme. We're really thrilled this year to announce a new partnership between National Geographic Society and the NI Science Festival, which will see 4 explorers from across the world talk about their inspiring research and careers to date. Tonight's event's with Dr. Lucy Hawkes, a brilliant marine biologist, and she's going to be in conversation with presenter, broadcaster, YouTuber Greg Foote. We hope you enjoy, and if you do, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and follow us for more info. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the National Geographic Explorer series as part of Northern Ireland Science Festival. The NI Science Festival and National Geographic have teamed up to bring you 4 fantastic events featuring 4 prominent explorers who are going to be sharing their really inspiring and super interesting research, stories and adventures with me. My name is Greg Foote. I'm a science presenter and producer. I make shows on TV and radio and YouTube and a couple of podcasts as well. And it's a real privilege to get to sit down and just have this time one-on-one talking to these fantastic explorers. So I'm so looking forward to it. Lots of people know National Geographic, the brand, from the TV channel, from the magazine, of course. Some people may have started first from social media. In fact, @NatGeo on Instagram has over 150 million followers. Wowzers. However, National Geographic started as a scientific society. Its headquarters were in Washington, DC, and it funded scientists and explorers to travel the world doing amazing expeditions. And it's still doing that 130 plus years later. The society has now given out over 14,000 grants to scientists and to storytellers and to educators and conservationists and people that kind of cross over all those different titles. And what they all have in common is that they want to share a love and a need to protect the wonderful world that we live in. What they also share, indeed, is the title National Geographic Explorer, which is a very cool title to have. In this series of events, I get to chat to 4 explorers, one a session, to find out more about their adventures. We're starting today, this is going to be a really fun one, with marine biologist Dr. Lucy Hawkes. And then the next event is with award-winning natural history photographer and research scientist Jeff Kirby. Then the next one is TV presenter and wildlife filmmaker Malika Vaz. And the final one is ocean-focused bioengineer Kakani Kataja. So fantastic lineup. Big thanks to NI Science Festival for inviting me to have these conversations. What a pleasure. I encourage you to go and have an explore of the NI SciFest website, because there are over 250 talks and workshops and shows happening over the next 11 days, covering science and engineering and maths and arts and just all sorts of things. Go and have a look, and also check out @NI SciFest on social as well. Okay. Enough of that. It's time to introduce the National Geographic Explorer, who is going to kick off our inaugural series. Hello, marine biologist Dr. Lucy Hawke.
Hi, Greg. How are you?
I am very good. First of all, is that a green screen or is that a real map?
This is a real map. I've actually got it balanced on an ironing board because I'm getting much better at this whole presenting from home business. But you can just
classic.
like a Swedish furniture retailer.
Oh, that well-known one. Great. Great meatballs. So I really hope that there's going to be like little Arctic terns that you're going to fly across the...
Wouldn't that be good? Like moving magnets at the back. I could co-opt my partner at home and get them to like move them up and down.
on a stick or something underneath the camera. Look, I should stop waffling on. I'm going to give the floor to you first for 10 or 15 minutes to tell us all about your research and your work, and then we can regroup and we can chat some more.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to share some slides I've put together for you, which I feel hopefully will set the scene about why I'm passionate about the work that I do. So what you can see on this slide here is a white stork. And this white stork was shot in Germany in 1822. And it's actually stuffed in a museum in Germany today. But the hunters were stunned to see this stork had this enormous wooden spear sticking through its neck. And it's an unbelievable animal. Back in 1822, hundreds of years ago, Europeans and most people across the world actually didn't understand anything about animal migration. And there were lots of weird stories about why animals disappeared when they weren't in Germany anymore in the winter, for example. And white storks were actually thought to go to war I know that sounds mad, but it's actually true. Check this out. This is an etching from the Nuremberg Chronicles showing storks at war. And you can also see here some carvings on some Roman and some Greek vases showing warring storks. So this was this mad theory about where these animals disappeared to in the wintertime. What we now know, because people like me can use tracking technologies to follow the movements of these animals, is that storks that breed in Germany in the winter actually migrate down across Africa, all the way down to Botswana and South Africa, where they probably spend the winter and have a lovely time, nice warm weather. About here, I should use my map. And what we think probably happened to this particular stork is that a hunter there attempted to catch it. Unbelievably missed hitting anything important. The stork escaped with its life, flew all the way back up to Germany, where it encountered another hunter, this time who was much more fortunate and actually succeeded in shooting this stork. So this is a really unfortunate tale of a stork, but what this stork carries in its neck is in effect the world's first ever animal tracking device. This 3-foot wooden spear is the first bit of kind of proper evidence we had to connect these two amazingly distant parts of the planet and made us realise that these animals were capable of travelling between them. And I think about this wooden spear all the time. Today, we use a range of far more sophisticated, tiny electronic tracking devices. I've got some of them here with me today. You can get an idea about quite how small these are. I mean, these are teeny tiny little things, and we can put them on a range of cool different animals. We've actually been able to track dragonflies, you can see here, using tiny little devices, but we also have much bigger ones. For example, I've been deploying cameras on massive sharks in Scotland so that I can peer into their private lives and understand more about what they're doing when they visit Scottish waters. And because of this tracking, we now know far more about amazing wildlife. This is an elephant seal. It's huge. They can weigh well over a ton. But we know because of animal tracking devices that they can dive to 2,388 meters under the water. Can you imagine holding your breath and swimming 2,388 meters down and back up again? If any of you have started running during lockdown, this is like doing a 5K holding your breath the whole way. It's just crazy. We also know that animals can travel really high too. So this is a bird that I've actually studied as well, called the Barheaded Goose. And this is like a 2 kilo grey, flappy, angry goose, but it can fly to 7,290 meters. So this is above Everest base camp. So they can get really, really high. We know that some animals can travel incredibly fast. This is a Cygre antelope. It's the weirdest looking animal. And I knew that these were fast. I'd heard they could do like 80 kilometers an hour. But a few years ago, I was in the back of a Russian van in outer Mongolia, near the Russian border. And we're driving along doing maybe 100 kilometers an hour. And I look out the window, I'm like half asleep. And I just see this brown blur overtaking us in the distance. And I was like, what on earth is that? And it can only have been a Cygre antelope. There's a very small population of these left, and there are very few other animals on Earth that can go that fast. I'm a marine biologist. I love everything that lives in the sea, but that might have possibly been the coolest wildlife thing I ever saw. Just for reference, Usain Bolt is about half as fast as a Cygre antelope, still an amazing 43.5 kilometers an hour, mind blowing. But you'll be amazed to hear that this small bird, the great snipe, it's about the size of a mango, not as delicious, I imagine, can actually maintain the same speed, but it can do it for 96 hours at a time. And they do this in a migration over Scandinavia. And that sounds amazing, right? You must think, wow, that's about the coolest that any animal can do. No, this is even better. This is a bird called the Bartailed Godwit. We have godwits wintering off our shores around the British Isles. So if you head off to the beach in Northern Ireland, you're probably likely to see some species of godwits. But there's a particular population that breeds in Alaska and winters in lovely New Zealand. And when it finishes breeding in Alaska, it gets up, starts flying, and flies in one non-stop flight of 11,000 kilometers to New Zealand. We know from its flight speed, there's almost no way it can stop to eat, to drink, to sleep, to rest at all. 7 days non-stop, just hardcore flight all the way. It's absolutely spectacular animal. Unbelievably, it isn't the world distance record holder. That is actually held by the Arctic tern, which you can see here. I actually study these as part of my work as a National Geographic explorer. And as their name suggests, they live in the Arctic, they breed there, all around the Arctic. And when they finish breeding, they go, do you know what? I might go visit Antarctica. So they make a migration across the entire planet. So the ones we know about are coming down across the Atlantic. They then go all across Antarctica, most of the way to Australia, before they come back to the Arctic again the next spring to breed. So these guys can cover 80,000 kilometers in the course of a year, and they're long lived. They can live to 30 years, which means that one Arctic tern can cover enough distance to make 6 return trips to the moon. And I can't tell you what it's like to hold one of these birds in your hands. Like, you can see they're quite small. They weigh about 100 grams, like a little pack of sandwiches. But when you hold this bird and you think, like, next time I see you, little buddy, you're going to have been to Antarctica and back again on your own, like under your own power. In 2004, I ran the London Marathon, and I trained really, really hard. But I remember at the start line, my mum came with me, and I changed into my race clothes and gave her my other stuff. And I knew I could probably do the marathon, but it was the anticipation of this huge journey ahead of me. Like, I cried, and my mum gave me a cuddle and was like, "You're going to do it. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine." But I think about that moment when I hold this little bird in my hand, and I just think, you'll be okay, you'll be okay. And of course he will, it's an Arctic tern, it's fine. But I will probably never be closer to a more astonishing athlete ever than this particular bird. And these particular birds are flying ahead of us all around the British Isles. In fact, we have in our skies and our seas and our land all around us loads of incredible animal athletes every single year. No matter where you are on the planet, billions of tons of animals are actually migrating over your head every single year. And most of the time, we don't even really know about it. In this map here in pink, you can see the autumnal movements of animals cascading down towards the equator, towards lovely warm conditions to have a nice winter somewhere nice and warm and lovely. But while all of these animals are all across the planet, in all different remote parts of the planet, they're actually being ever more closely circled by humans. And we humans are starting to occupy every part of the planet. So here you can see a map showing the movements of container ships, cruise ships, fishing boats, all sorts of different vessels crisscrossing the oceans. And you can see that with the exception of the poles, which are being increasingly used actually, but with the exception of the poles, no bit of ocean is really being untouched by boat traffic. And the same is true of the skies. Here you can see a map showing the movements of loads of different aircraft. These are cargo flights as well as passenger flights. These are flights bringing you mangoes in the middle of winter, or sugar snap peas, or cheap fashion, or new cars. All these things that we humans have decided we're entitled to buy at any point of the year whenever we choose. The world has changed enormously and we occupy most of it. As a consequence, there are very few completely wild parts of the planet remaining. And these fragile, untouched, truly wild areas are probably more endangered than any of the animals that I'll ever study. And the world population stands at 7.6 billion people and increasing. So we are ever more spreading into these increasingly fragile areas. While COVID-19 is ravaging the planet, and while we wait for it to be brought under control, we are now giving nature a bit of an unprecedented moment of peace. And this is quite a good time for us to think about what we want our future relationship with nature to look like. We need nature. We've used it for a long time for things like food and for fuel, for things like ecotourism, people paying money to go out and look at dolphins or whales. But they've also got more applied uses too. In tropical areas, bats eat mosquitoes that can spread diseases. About 8% of our global crops are pollinated by insects like wasps and bees that actually we couldn't do otherwise. Of course, they've been a fantastic inspiration for engineering. Things like aircraft wings are inspired by the wings of birds like eagles. And we also, of course, get a lot of pharmaceutical drugs from wildlife as well. Aspirin comes from trees, painkillers come from poppies, penicillins come from molds. But what we now know is that in addition to these uses, wild animals actually hold a lot of the solutions for many of our future major problems. For example, obesity is a massive problem for humans, but here you can see an obese Bartailed Godwit. On the left-hand side, this is a Bartailed Godwit prior to that amazing flight from Alaska. And on the right-hand side, you can see how skinny it is by the time it arrives. these birds can get up to 150% body fat. For reference, 55% is considered morbidly obese in humans. So these dudes are like little flying bundles of fat, but they live long, healthy, athletic lives. How do they manage that? And birds are also basically all diabetic. Birds have incredibly high blood sugar levels, about twice as much sugar in their blood as a mammal of the same size. But unlike humans, they don't suffer nerve damage, don't have to have their toes amputated. How do they manage that? And we haven't yet tried to work out how to translate these amazing things that wildlife can do into solutions for humans going forwards. A lack of oxygen is one of the major things that causes humans to die. But we know that diving animals like this wonderful humpback whale that you can see here have solved this challenge. Those elephant seals I mentioned earlier, we know from tracking them that when they're at sea, they spend only 2% of their time at the surface. So 98% of the time they're holding their breath. So they're regularly experiencing really low oxygen conditions. How do they do that, and how can we learn as humans? And of course, finally, the most striking example is COVID-19. We've got reason to believe that COVID-19 may have come to humans from bats, but bats may also hold the solution to COVID-19. And that's because when people become seriously ill with COVID-19, we know that what happens to them is kind of like the immune system just goes a bit wild. It becomes unregulated and it makes some mistakes. The biggest thing it does is it sends out a load of signaling proteins, these kind of compounds that tell your body what to do. And essentially they lead to inflammation. They cause you to inflame really badly. Everything goes horribly wrong and you die. Bats are mammals. They have the same immune systems that we do, but we know that bats are really good at carrying viruses, but without getting sick. And we now know that that's because bats have these signaling proteins, but they're able to tightly control them to stop them running out of control and causing inflammation. And actually, this might be an adaptation to flight. Again, if you've taken up running or exercise during lockdown, you know that a couple of days after you exercise, you have quite sore muscles and you're kind of stretching and being like, oh my God. Well, flying is much harder work than running. So exercise causes your muscles to swell a bit and to hurt. So flying is going to cause them to hurt and swell even more. Well, in order to be able to keep flying, bats have had to kind of like dampen this response. And that's actually led to them responding to viruses in a very different way and remaining healthy despite being infected by viruses. So perhaps bats actually hold the future solutions for us. So our hope for a better planet rests with not just studying and being inspired by these amazing wild animals, but protecting these special species that may hold the solutions to much of our future challenges, as well as the incredible and special wild areas they depend on, both in the seas and on the land. Thanks very much.
That was fascinating. God, cracking photos as well. And just seeing those images of the movements, those migrations was incredible. And I don't think I've ever heard as many amazing facts in such a short period of time. The fact that elephants...
The more I study wild animals, the more amazed I am by the stuff they can do. It's stunning. It really is.
Yeah, it's absolutely bonkers. Let's talk about animal migrations first then, because I know that's kind of your bread and butter. For your PhD, I believe you were the first person to track sea turtles, I think?
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you go about tracking sea turtles? You showed us some of the little kind of devices you can use, but how did you do it then with sea turtles? But most importantly, what did you feel it could teach us?
Yes, so sea turtles, it turns out, are really easy to track. Birds are very difficult to catch because they can fly, whereas sea turtles are lovely and slow when they come onto the beach to reproduce. So despite being animals that live in the sea, they lay their eggs on a beach. And they're so big and so heavy, they kind of crawl up the beach like this. So it's quite easy to come up behind them. And then we basically clean their shell with like a washing up sponge and then like a Brillo pad. And then I use a bit of nail polish remover to remove any grease. So that's because anybody knows if you're trying to glue two things together, you want to make sure you prepare your surface really well. And then you basically put a bit of glue on the bottom of the transmitter and stick it on the turtle shell. And every time the turtle comes up to breathe air, the transmitter will link up to a satellite and send a message, which is really, really cool. And we were able to show the migration routes of lots of these different species of turtles I was really lucky that I started kind of studying marine biology around the time that tracking technology became cheaper and better. So I can't believe I was lucky enough to be the first person to be able to discover some of these routes. But we found out that these turtles use the waters of lots of different countries. So for instance, I tracked a population here in West Africa. Isn't this map great? And what we found from those turtles is that they travel over this whole area, so they don't really stay put for long. And what that means is that if we want to effectively conserve sea turtles, we've got to get lots of different countries to work together. And increasingly now, scientists pretty much never work as one country. We always work across national boundaries. So I regularly work with scientists from lots of other countries. And personally, that's been great because I get to see the world from other people's perspectives, which is fantastic.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the kind of take homes from that was that if these turtles are moving around these various places and you are showing that for the first time with new data, you're giving equity and responsibility to multiple countries so that you can then use that as a jumping off point to talk about policy change and protection of habitats, and also collaboration between those areas, which must have been really powerful at the time if that had not been done before.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, because we although we kind of do our science sat at a desk with a fancy computer, we also, as scientists, it's one of the things I love about being a scientist, by the way, we work at the coalface as well. So I'll be on a beach having not slept very well for 3 days, kind of like with my hair all matted, trying to find a turtle at night to put a transmitter on it. And I love that breadth of techniques it takes to be a scientist. But I do that with local people. So through our work, we've been able to work with students from countries like Mongolia, like the Cape Verde Islands, and actually bring them to the UK, for example, to do a PhD with us, to do masters with us, to help them to publish their work in scientific journals and gain their own credibility. And I love that about my job. I love being able to work with people and actually kind of allow them into my privileged world as a European to be able to do exactly the same job as me. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good point that people don't really think about very much. Let's talk tech. I want to talk more tech. You showed us some of those devices, but when I was kind of doing my research, it looks like you might almost be able to take us through the evolution of those devices. And I'd love to get to kind of like satellite telemetry, heart rate logging, all the other stuff that you're able to do when you're collecting your data about these migrations. Go on, dive in.
Well, there's basically 3 different types of tracking. So you can have remote tracking, which is when you track an animal and you get information remotely about where it is. So for example, you can use a tag like this one. So this is actually wearing an Arctic tern's little backpack, because they kind of go on like a little backpack. And this antenna is very important because it will broadcast data to a local base station that I put into the colony where these birds nest. But if I had a bigger one of these that would go on something like a goose or a duck, it can broadcast that to a satellite. And so I basically put the tag on the animal, and what the tag actually does is it basically shouts its name out. So it basically just goes, I'm Lucy, I'm Lucy, I'm Lucy, on a particular wavelength that the satellite is listening out on. And as the satellite passes over the animal, the pitch at which it hears, I'm Lucy, changes because of something called the Doppler effect. This is what happens when a car drives past you, and you get the
Yep.
like that. The noise the car is making is the same. It just sounds different to you because it's further or closer to you. So as the relative distance between you and the thing making the noise changes, you hear it in a slightly different way. Same for the satellite. So the satellite, I guess, hears, this is Lucy, this is Lucy, this is Lucy, this is Lucy, this is Lucy. So it knows when it's got closest to me. And there's actually about 6 of these satellites that are all making this same kind of calculation at the same time, so they can triangulate where the animal is. And that's what we kind of call basic satellite tracking. And that's probably the bread and butter of animal tracking. First done in 1982 on a basking shark. The tags can now last for probably 4 years, but back then they only really did about 20 days. So the batteries have got better, the processors are more efficient.
Wow.
They're very expensive. Satellite tags are usually at least $1,500 to sometimes over $6,000. The reason they're expensive is because they don't sell very many. It's not a big market, but also because trying to do this job yourself, trying to get in a camper van and follow a bird as it migrates around the planet is pretty difficult work. So, so they are very expensive.
Jumping in on that, Lucy, how many do you get back? Like, what's the percent? I'm sure it depends on the species, but you know, if it's a returning bird, then you odds are on for them coming back to their nest site. But what about some of the larger animals? Like, what is the loss rate?
So the loss rate can be very high. So we actually design into many of our tags an ability for them to fall off, so the animal doesn't have to carry it for the rest of its life. So we tag basking sharks, for example, in Scotland, which are these like 10-meter long sharks. They're insane. And we have never seen any of them again, but we know from the tracking data that they are around. Wow. But the tags have got like a little corrosible link that burns and jettisons the tag off the shark and it comes off to the surface. Arctic terns, we rely on catching the birds again. So this tiny tag I showed you before, it's so wee. I wore these as earrings once at an event.
Cool.
As you do. Hashtag women in science. These are so tiny that they don't have enough battery to transmit data, so you have to get them back. And in some projects, we've had as much as 50% of the tags back. With our Arctic Tern project at the moment, we're not doing so well, actually. We've only got about 20% of the tags back. And we think in part that's because there's been quite a bit of a disruption in breeding in Iceland, and they seem to have had a couple of bad years. So we think they probably turn up to breed, maybe don't succeed and go, I'll go somewhere else for a bit. And of course, we're not there to find them again. So
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a whole part of that conversation of how disposable the tech is, what happens when the tech enters the environment that you're trying to study, you know, the pros and cons of that sort of thing. But that was the remote type of sensors. You were going to go through 3 before, I believe?
Yes, so you get archival tracking, which is actually what this is. So an archival tag is a tag that's recording a bunch of data, but you have to get it back. So it's just like a USB stick in that respect. It doesn't transmit anything. And the advantage of that is that you can save loads of the battery life for collecting more information. But you usually have to use archival tracking if you're working on very small species, because you just can't carry enough battery on the animal to be able to transmit the data. So this is an archival tag. And then this one is also an archival tag. This is like a tiny Fitbit. So it records 3 axes of movement on the animal: forwards, backwards, left, right, and up and down. Wow. So if the bird is flapping, if it's having a poo, if it's doing a little sleep, I can pick it all up just from looking at this tag, but I do have to get it back to do it. So that's quite difficult. And then the third type of tracking is what we call inferential tracking. So I'm going to infer that you've been there. So this is a little bit like when your toddler is covered in Nutella and you walk in the sitting room and there's Nutella on the sofa. You're like, have you been in here? That's exactly what it is. So we have different techniques for doing that. We've got genetics. We've got something called stable isotopes. So we can use chemical forms of commonly occurring elements in the environment that we know actually vary in quite a predictable way around the planet to work out where an animal might have come from. So, for example, my hair is obviously continuously growing, and I am synthesizing elements from the environment all around me in my tissues. If I was to go to India, the point on the map again because I can, if I was to go over to India, I would carry some of these characteristically British isotopes with me over there. And if you resampled my hair when I came back again, you'd be able to tell that I'd left for a bit and come back again. It's quite cool.
Wow, that's fascinating for that degree of tiny changes that can tell you so much. It's almost Sherlock Holmesy, isn't it? And it's
really cool. And then the really cool thing is that the collection of these isotopes in my blood lasts for about a week. In my muscles, it lasts for a couple of weeks, but in my hair, it's permanently synthesized. So you could actually sample me. So you could sample me a week after I got back from India and you'd know I'd been there. But if I gave it a month, you probably wouldn't be able to tell from my blood. And then you'd have to have a look back through my hair. But what you could do is you could take my hair, you could chop it all up into, don't do this, Greg, but you could chop it all up into loads of little sections and you could reconstitute my travel diary and we could put it on this map.
Wow, that's like, I guess it's the equivalent to drilling a big ice core and looking back at the climate history.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Tell me, you've clearly got a lot of stories. I've been told of a lot of stories that you've experienced. Give us your most comical or most embarrassing encounter that you've experienced?
So I think, oh God, I think the worst one was, so sea turtles lay their nests on beaches and they dig a great big hole and then they lay their eggs in the hole. And so often we take guided tours of people to go and have a look. So we say, let us show you what the turtle's doing and we'll explain why it's doing what it's doing. And we often take an egg out of the nest so we can show the people. So we wear a glove, but you take the egg out and you say, this is what an egg looks like, and they're really cool. Well, green sea turtles, which are one of the most beautiful species of sea turtles, happen to lay really, really deep nests. So they dig a very, very big hole before they start laying their eggs. So I'm with this group of tourists and I went to get an egg out, but I slipped and it was so deep. I just went in head first, but I didn't, with my hands, I could either push on the turtle or push on the nest and I would have collapsed the sand. So I had to just go, wah! And just ended up in this turtle's nest with just my head in this nest. And I had to go like, someone pull me out, please. So tourists had to pull me out by my ankles.
That's the pinnacle of research. I mean, that's what happens though. It's real. It's real. That's what happens.
At school, you too can get stuck in a turtle nest.
Become a scientist. If you're watching this now and you've just joined this conversation about falling into turtle nest holes, welcome. This is the first of 4 conversations that I'm having with National Geographic explorers for NI Science Festival. I'm Greg Foote. I'm a science presenter and producer. This is marine biologist, ecologist, Dr. Lucy Hawkes. Do go look at the National Geographic Society website because there's loads more explorers to discover, lots and lots of information about them as well. And it's perhaps worth mentioning as well that the funding that these explorers get is from the non-profit side of National Geographic, the National Geographic Society, and it uses the power of science, exploration, education, and storytelling to illuminate and to protect the wonder of the world. Back to Lucy. We've heard of a funny experience. What's the most challenging experience? Because you must get challenges with the tech, not just losing the tech, but also, not being able to track where the birds have gone, or making a calculation error before that all happens and the whole thing is kind of lost. But what have you experienced in the past that you think are the biggest challenges in your career, and how have you faced them and overcome them?
Yeah, so one of the joys of my job is working with wild animals. I get to see really cool animals up close that other people don't get to, but it is stressful too because it's really hard to catch wild animals. Birds in particular, of course, they can fly, so obviously it makes it incredibly hard to catch them. And I was studying this cool goose called the Barheaded Goose in Mongolia for about 5 years. And when we turned up, everybody said it's very straightforward. When they breed, they lose their ability to fly. So feathers, like car tires, actually get worn down at their edges and they become less efficient for flying with. So once a year, ducks, geese and swans just drop all of the feathers from the bottom part of their wing here and then regrow them all one by one. And so for about 3 weeks, they can't fly. So they say, it's going to be easy. We can catch these birds. Don't you worry. So we're like, cool. So we see them near a lake. So they get onto this lake and they start swimming away from us. So we're like, it's okay. We've got this. We get a kayak, we get in the water and we try to paddle them and sort of herd them in towards a net on the bank of the lake. And it was impossible. It was really hard. The birds were quite uncontrollable. If you pushed them a little bit too hard, they panicked and scattered everywhere. Of course, everybody had a different opinion about how to do it. So there was loads of arguments. And this went on for about the first 2 years of my first proper professional research job. And I was thinking, I'll never get any data because we just can't catch these birds. They're just too difficult to catch. And on top of that as well, you don't want to stress these animals. I want to find out where they go because I want to help to conserve them, but I don't want to do that to their detriment. And sometimes catching birds in particular is quite dangerous. They can get very stressed and they can die if you're not careful. So that was really, really stressful. And I've also had a similar situation. Just last year, I was working in the Red Sea to attempt to catch and put tracking tags on a range of different sharks. And I was really sobered by the lack of sharks. I spent over 70 hours fishing for sharks. I put 130 hours in baiting cameras and putting them on the seafloor trying to find sharks. We went down in submarines, we used helicopters, and we only found one shark in just 7 weeks. So that was not only stressful, I mean, we haven't got any data because we only got one shark, but it was also really devastating as a scientist to think that I'm in the here and now trying to do my bit, but these species are kind of vanishing before our eyes. And that's really challenging.
There's quite a lot in what you've just said, actually, that I want to pull out. So one is the time scale that the research takes, 2-5+ years. That takes patience, resilience, a heck of a lot of planning and strategy. You've then got you've brought up the issue of climate change, of lack of biodiversity, of scarcity of these animals that we've known and loved and that have an important role in the ecosystem, but also the stress. Let's just talk about that briefly. What you're doing is polishing the back of a turtle shell and putting something on. Maybe it won't feel that as much as a tern may feel, a few grams on its back. Where is the line? I'm sure you've as a scientist, as a human, you've had this conversation in your head before. How are you affecting the wildlife versus also being able to record natural behavior?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think about this an awful lot at the moment. In fact, I've just recently won a small research grant to look at this in sharks. Because what we're trying to do is have a net benefit. And I won't lie, being a scientist is really fun. And it's wonderful going to see these animals up close. I appreciate I have a very privileged position to be able to do it. But I don't do this for fun and enjoyment. I do this because I want to make a difference to the world. So you do have to make that cost benefit kind of trade-off all the time. Fortunately, none of our work, particularly in the UK, we have one of the strictest animal kind of ethics systems in the world, the only one underpinned by criminal law. So we go to prison if we do bad stuff, which is good. We should. But we have big committees of people that have to review what we say we want to do, that will evaluate whether we actually are exceeding the harm that we may cause these animals with the benefit that it might bring about, for instance, by being able to say, you spend 30% of your time in Senegalese waters, so I'm going to go talk to the Senegalese Ministry of Fisheries about how we can change the way fishing is happening there. But also how we catch these animals as well, as I mentioned, is stressful to the animals themselves. So we always try where we can to work with local people. So for example, I know collaborators of mine working in Africa on sharks always collaborate with local fishermen. These are fishermen that have been catching these animals for decades. They know more than us scientists ever will. So we try to collaborate where we can with local people who can tell us exactly what to do. We try to work in our local countries. One of the wonderful things about the National Geographic Society actually is that National Geographic funds people to do work where possible in their own countries. So there's no kind of, in the past it's been called imperial conservation, where we kind of turn up in a lovely holiday destination with some cool species that we can do some work on. National Geographic Society says, I want to fund local people to do local work that matters to them. And I think that's exemplary and so exciting about National Geographic Society. But yeah, so it's important to work with local people. It's important to be reviewed, to be constantly open to criticism, to be constantly open to learning better ways of doing our work, because ultimately what we really want is to deliver really watertight data that gives solutions to the way we can conserve these animals going forwards.
And there's a lot that you can get from that. You've already touched on a lot of that already. It's not only the collaboration, the empowerment of the local communities and broadening and almost wisening their relationships. Like, as you say, they know the animals better than ever, but the conservation around it, can be discussed. But also, it's, as you say, it's what you can learn from those animals. And this is what I kind of want to focus on in the last bit of our chat. You talked about the obese godwit. You talked about diabetic birds, and bats, and actually how they are coping with carrying virus. Can you give me any examples of things we have learned through the act of tracking? And then I think we'll go on to what else you're excited about in addition to those ones you introduce us to.
Yeah, that's an incredibly tricky question. It's a great question, Greg. What can I think of? What can we learn through tracking? There's certainly been, so for example, the Pacific Ocean, relatively speaking, is quite a poor ocean. It doesn't have great productivity compared to, say, the Atlantic. So we think that the Pacific Ocean is a bit of a desert. There's still lots of fishing going on there, but anyway. But when we've been tracking animals, we've discovered that lots of them, particularly leaving like the coast of California and Mexico, travel out to this particular spot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So for a bit, it was known as the White Shark Cafe, but we know that elephant seals go there. We now know that seabirds go there as well. And we think we've found, for example, an island of productivity out there. And then more recent work has kind of looked at the distribution of fishing across the oceans, because fishing boats are pretty good at finding animals, actually. I'm reading a book about gulls at the moment because I love gulls. I'm really into gulls. And it was talking about this kind of mutualistic relationship between fishing boats will actually look at, if they see a flock of gulls, they'll be like, I wonder if there's some food over there. So they'll go fish there. But likewise, if a boat is fishing, a bunch of gulls will go, there's a boat fishing there, we'll go check it out. So they actually kind of depend on one another quite nicely. But we can actually have a look and see what's really going on in this patch of ocean. So I guess these animals led us to discover this island of productivity in the middle of this Pacific desert that we didn't kind of know about.
But also lots of the animals, to go back to your introduction, the way that they behave is as signals for the state of the health of the planet.
Yeah.
It seems. And I don't know if there are any others that come to mind that you think do signal problems and problem areas, or that you can almost use as benchmarks to see not CO2, composition or percentages, but like that's a hotspot, or there's a specific issue there from looking at the ecology and the trends and the behaviors and the distribution. Tell me a bit more about that if you know it, but then also let's turn around to what we can do. Everyone watching, what are some practical tips that you as an ecologist, marine biologist, with your experience, what can we do to help the planet?
So to answer the first part of your question, there's a couple of initiatives out there. So the one that I showed the slide from is a German project called MoveBank. And MoveBank is attempting to put together loads of animal tracking data, because my sharks, my turtles, my seabirds can tell me stuff about the environment. But if you put them together with all of their other ocean and terrestrial buddies, and then you start to look at them over timescales of years and years and decades, you can really start to see some big patterns precipitating. So I'm part of some of those projects, but I don't lead those projects. But what we're trying to do is put together a big thing so that you can kind of almost see the planet breathing via the wildlife. So you can kind of see this kind of pulsing up in spring and coming back down in winter and up and down. And I think when we start to look at that, because we've been tracking now since about the 80s, really. So when you start looking at those patterns over decades, we're going to start to see whether these animals can actually arrive on time in spring. Because one of the critical things about climate change is that it's dramatically altering when spring arrives. It's making it earlier and earlier. And as a migrating bird, you want to make sure you arrive on time. You want the food to be really good. You want to get access to the best nesting spots. And some species might be better at doing that than others. So what we want to do is stick these data together so we can work out which are the birds that we could predict our climate with, and which are the ones that we might need to give special attention to and a little bit of a hand. And I think these kind of big multi-project collaborative initiatives are still very young. They haven't really produced some of the major papers coming out yet. So I think that's something that's going to happen like within my career that I'm really, really excited about.
Yeah, I love that idea of using lots of indicator species to do a global map, the macro, not just the micro, so we can see the whole picture of what's happening and react to it. So then to the part two, what can we do to help our planet?
Yeah, so there's been a really interesting report that's come out just this spring about the prosperity of biodiversity. And what this report has showed is that human kind of progress has generally come at an enormous cost to wildlife. And we've, as I mentioned, almost every part of the planet is being impacted by humans in some way. But while we are negatively impacting nature, we need nature for our future solutions. And it's so easy to think that you're just one person and that your impact isn't that bad, so it doesn't really matter. But it's a cumulative kind of effect of all of our individual impacts that really matter. So what I would challenge viewers of this talk to do is to look at every single part of their behavior that they could change at least some of the time, if not all of the time, to try to benefit nature. So for example, people talk about eating less meat, has a massive impact on your carbon footprint. Purchasing fruits and vegetables that have been air freighted across from Guatemala, because I love an avocado, but you basically can't get an avocado that hasn't been air freighted now. You know, almonds have a huge amount of water associated with their production. And it can feel like all the individual consumer choices that you need to make are overwhelming. And I think people are sometimes paralyzed into doing nothing. We must do something. We must do anything and everything that we can. And certainly in Europe, we have an incredibly privileged position that we have a lot more choice about what we can do than other nations do across the world. And I think the other thing that's quite difficult to swallow, and is one of our major challenges for society, is that human prosperity can go hand in hand with nature, but not the way we're doing it right now. And what we really need to do is actually kind of vote in the kind of political change that is going to put nature first. And that may, in some cases, come at economic cost to humans. It's really unpopular. Nobody wants to see that happen. But that is kind of what we need, because as COVID has showed us, if we push too hard into these wild spaces, if we don't give wildlife the space that we should, it's got the ability to bite back too.
Yeah, and you mentioned COVID earlier and said that, we've given this moment of peace to nature, but then you also hinted that it's also an opportunity for us to kind of bounce back greener, to grow back better. What would that look like? I know that's a massive question we could talk about for another hour, but what could that look like?
Well, I think that one of the things that working from home has done is taught us all how to talk by video conference like we are right now. So it's given us an ability to be able to work remotely. And so perhaps we could cut down loads of our trips, which could lead to a massive reduction in our carbon footprint. We scientists often have international conferences. It's very important to liaise with your international colleagues. It's very important to work across boundaries, but perhaps we don't necessarily need to travel to Hawaii or Japan for a research conference. And I, for one, I didn't do that before, but I definitely don't need to do that now, because we now have the infrastructure set up, thanks to lockdown, to be able to do some of these things remotely. So I think that helps enormously. The other thing is that because perhaps some of us have been more restricted to areas closer to our homes, we might be more aware of some of the local producers in our areas. Some of your listeners might have, veg boxes coming from their local markets, or might be buying meat from their local farmers. That's brilliant. That's the sort of thing that we need to be doing going forwards. So I think those are easy solutions that we can start to do right away.
Nice. Last question then, because sadly we don't have that much time together. We could chat for days. My last question is that I reckon there'll be lots of people watching who are just super inspired by these amazing places you've got to travel to, this proper impactful research you're doing, but also these phenomenal species that you get to spend time with over long periods of time. What would be your advice to anyone younger watching, or anyone older who wants to have a shift? What could they do to follow this path?
My number one advice to everybody is be brave, get out there. You can always run away. My parents taught me that from quite a young age. I remember as a child being, my parents used to send me on some mad stuff. Like, I remember when I was about 10 being in a kayak backwards on a ramp with a spray deck on, and somebody launching me off it, and I didn't have a clue how to kayak, but they just threw me at stuff. And I look back and I'm like, you're right, Mum, did you mean to do that? But it made me brave. And I got my start in marine biology by moving to North Carolina, USA. Okay. And that was to work on sea turtles. And I didn't know much about sea turtles. I knew that they nested on beaches. I was confused. I didn't know if that involved sticks. I was quite confused about all of that. But I thought, whatever, just give it a go and see what happens. And one thing led to another. They asked me to take over running the project. That turned into a PhD. That turned into some funding applications that were successful. And suddenly everything kind of rolled and went. So you have to put yourself out there. These exciting opportunities don't just come to you. And when you're out there, you broaden your horizons, you meet new people. And if you hate it, then you just run away and go back home again. You can always do. So be brave, get out there. Life is for living. Life's too short.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. Finally, what's next for you?
What is next for me? Oh, well, I'd like to go back to the Red Sea and keep trying to track those sharks. That hasn't gone very well so far because I think there's just so few sharks in the Red Sea. That's exciting because we've got the opportunity to feed into policy in the area, which we think will be really exciting. I'm going back to Iceland, fingers crossed, in June to go do my next season of research on Arctic terns to hopefully go get more of these amazing tags back. And what else am I doing? And hopefully going to Scotland in July or August to put some tags out on basking sharks again. I also am working on the magnificent bluefin tuna, which is like the supercar of the oceans. And they seem to be coming back to British shores in some fairly sizable numbers. They're definitely all around the Irish coast as well. And these are a really exciting fish. And we're trying to understand more about what brings them here to Britain, how regularly that we expect they might be here in the future, and particularly within the context of fishing. So can we have both a recreational and a commercial fishery for them in the future? So I'm finally working on my doorstep, like I told you, I think is really important. So I'm finally here working in British waters. I do miss the tropics, but I love working in the water. So
that combines so many things perfectly there, doesn't it? But also say hello to those Arctic terns. For me, they've gone 80,000 kilometers.
Yes, but you should come visit them because they are magnificent, but they are so furious, right? They're like 600 times smaller than a human, but they do not care. You walk in the colony, they dive bomb you, they poo all over you. If that doesn't get you moving, they peck you in the head and it bleeds. I mean, they peck you hard. They are so angry. And I love the fact that they're like these fearsome little predators. They're just kind of like, you go near my babies, you see what happens to you. Like, I love that about them. I mean, it's a bit scary and we have to wear bobble hats so that we don't get our heads hurt and they don't hurt their beaks, but they're wonderful. Come visit.
Sure. All right. What a great invitation. No, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. And Iceland's an incredible place. Lucy, thank you so much. That was fascinating to hear about your work and all about what the society has supported you to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
And thank you lot for watching. This was the first event in this National Geographic Explorer series for NI Science Festival. If you'd like to know more about some of the other National Geographic Explorers, then go visit the National Geographic Society website. You can find out so much stuff there about what they're all doing. Also, do check out what else is happening as part of the NI Science Festival as well. As I said, more than 250 events over 11 days across science, engineering, tech, maths, arts, so many workshops and talks and shows. So go have a look at NI Sci Fest. Our Explorer series continues tomorrow. That is Tuesday, the 16th of Feb at 7 p.m, where I'll be chatting with award-winning natural history photographer and research scientist, Jeff Kirby. See you then. Bye.